Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the QUT Faculty of Law for today's conference on intellectual property and education in the age of COVID. As is always the case, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, and in keeping with the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where QUT now stands and recognise that these have always been places of teaching and learning, and we wish to pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to play within the QUT community. And in the context of debates around intellectual property and education, there has been very significant discussion about the importance of Indigenous intellectual property. Today's event is going to look at some of the relationships and connections and intersections between intellectual property and education. It will cover many different species of intellectual property spanning copyright law, trademark law, patent law, trade secrets, and questions of licensing. In many ways, the conference today is also going to span an array of different disciplines within education, everything from the creative industries to medicine and biotechnology and even clean technology. In addition, this event is also going to focus upon open licensing within the educational institutions. So the use of open licensing to promote open access, open innovation and open data is also a very kind of important dimension in terms of the debate and discussion over intellectual property and education. This event is also going to focus upon the role of universities and educational institutions and research organisations in responding to the coronavirus COVID-19 public health crisis. So universities and research institutions have a very particular special role to play as keystones in the knowledge infrastructure. They are generating a whole wide range of technologies that could be of use in tackling the coronavirus crisis, including vaccines, treatments and diagnostics, as well as a range of other public policy solutions. So this event, amongst other things, is going to think about ways and means in which we can encourage public transfer of some of those research and public policy solutions. Finally, this event is also going to be an Australian launch for this research handbook on intellectual property and technology transfer, edited by Professor Jacob Rooksbury from Gonzaga Law School. This collection provides a comparative analysis of how an array of different countries manage intellectual property and technology transfer from educational institutions, and also kind of includes a contribution by myself looking at intellectual property and higher education and 3D printing. So welcome everyone. I hope you enjoy today's range of presentations looking at different aspects of intellectual property and education. Thank you. Professor Ginny Barbour is the Director of the Australasian Open Access Strategy Group and is the co-lead of the Office of Scholarly Communications at QUT, and she was one of the founding editors of the Public Library of Science Medicine. Today she's going to talk about how open access suddenly became the norm during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's certainly been a very kind of significant and important development. I've just been reading an open access book called Vulnerable on COVID law, ethics and public policy, and the University of Ottawa has made it open access and distributed it widely to kind of share their insights of public policy. But it finishes up with a piece by Jeremy De Beer and Richard Gold talking about the importance of open science and how the pandemic, amongst other things, has reinforced the need for us to invest in open access and open data and open science. And Ginny has been a great advocate for many years for building up some of our open access infrastructure in relation to education. Jim.
Great, thank you very much, Matthew. I'm really delighted to be doing this talk. It's incredibly timely, as you say, and has suddenly caught the attention of people that really were not paying very much attention to it before. So my title of my talk is How Open Access Suddenly Became the Norm. All it takes is a pandemic. There are some upsides to this. But what I'd just really like to get across in this talk is that we shouldn't take this for granted, and there are some really key issues that are already beginning to happen that may mean this is not going to be the norm if we're not very careful about it. So of course we know that open access is not new. It's been going for at least 2 decades. Australia's been at the forefront of many of the initiatives. So ANU had a first repository back in 2000. QUT, where we are now, had the world's first open access repository policy in 2003. That was a real leadership moment. And since then, there have been diverse regional, national and global actions really continuing. And through all of that time, there's been varying degrees of collaboration across the globe and regionally. Behind all of that are some really key infrastructure. So the things I'd just like to really point out are the importance of things such as permanent identifiers. So digital object identifiers, DOIs for articles and for other research outputs, ORCID identifiers for individuals. These were not present back in 2000 and have been really important in driving meaningful open access as opposed to just free access. The importance of Creative Commons licenses. The Creative Commons again started back in the early 2000s and has now grown to be a global movement that is incredibly important as underlying infrastructure in signifying how articles, outputs and really pretty much any sort of scholarly research can be managed. And of course it has applications outside of scholarship. There's many different models for open access publishing, so journals, books, other platforms. PLOS, where I was originally, started in 2004. Biomed Central came before that, but since then there's been an outpouring of different types of models, both not-for-profit, scholarly-led, and also big commercial publishers, of course. There's also been a huge amount of repository infrastructure. So in Australia, the primary model for open access to articles is via repositories, sometimes called green, but we're trying to move away from using sort of colours because it's very confusing. But we have infrastructure for articles, for data, and for other research outputs now, and that's all been growing. And of course, we're seeing now new models of publishing, so preprints and overlay journals. So preprints are the versions of articles that are submitted to journals before they've been peer-reviewed. But of course, they're not even new, really. They've been going since 1991. Archive.org was founded by the physics community and has been where they've had a tremendous model of sharing for many, many years. And that's now increasingly being taken up, including most recently, even in the medical sphere. And I'll talk about that later because that's been very important and quite surprisingly important in this pandemic. And so when you think about collaboration in policy, and other areas globally, there's a lot going on again. So back in the 2000s, there was the Budapest, Berlin and Bethesda declarations on open access, again, many of which actually predated the infrastructure that we had in place. So for example, the Budapest Open Access Initiative was too early to be able to talk about Creative Commons licenses, but if you read them, that's what's within them, is actually a sort of implicit understanding of the importance of licenses. A lot of this work has come from Europe, so OpenAir has been a big collaborative project, particularly around repositories and sharing data, and it's been baked into policies such as Horizon 2020, which is obviously coming to its end now, and will be baked into EU policy going forward. Within South America, it's notable that it's a very different model for publishing, open access publishing, and these are sort of essentially supported by institutions, supported by governments as large collaborative projects, so Cielo and Redelac, and they are somewhat in tension with some of the initiatives that are going on elsewhere, but have provided within the Latin American context a huge sort of support for open access that's truly collaborative. And then more recently in Europe, we've had Open Access 2020, which was driven by the Max Planck Institute in Berlin, and they have had a systematic project of turning open access journals, subscription journals to open access. And that was really the springboard for Plan S, which came from an organisation called Coalitionus, which was initially a group of funders within in Europe, but now more globally, and is pursuing a very aggressive strategy towards open access, but not just through journals, including most recently through retaining rights so that authors can really fully implement repository-based open access. And there are many, many organisations working in this sphere, including the one that I'm involved in, the Open Access Strategy Group in Australasia. But two really key ones have been SPARC, the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition in North America and in EU, and they have really brought together many of the key players within this area. But the thing is, we've been talking about this for 20 years, and this is a slide that only talks about open access in Australia, right back from the ANU repository back in 2000. But if you look up right at the top, we've still only got to the point where we're still talking about it, despite some really key government discussions, and I'll just highlight a couple. There's the Productivity Commission back in 2016 recommended a national open access policy. The government accepted it in 2017 and has done nothing to implement it. In 2018, a committee of the House of Representatives also made a recommendation, this time for a policy on open science. But again, the government actually has not yet responded to that because of the federal election and various other things that have gone in the way. So I think it's fair to say that's probably not going to be on this government's agenda at this point. So despite all of these groups being involved in advocating for a national approach, we're still at the point where we're just considering it. Earlier this year, before the pandemic really hit, the Open Access Strategy Group and CAUL, the Council of Australian University Librarians, convened a workshop where we brought together a large number of groups to talk about the need for a national approach. We'd intended to do it in Canberra. Of course, that didn't happen. We literally called it off the week of the meeting was due to happen, but we did reconvene it virtually about a month later and had agreement we need a national approach, but we are at the point where we need to decide who owns that and how that goes forward. And there's no question that the COVID-19 pandemic has helped solidify the discussions around that. So that's where we were in March 2020, and there's a little coronavirus there at the bottom, and then of course things started to change after that, because the real issue that we have right now is that despite the fact 20 years after all these initiatives and declarations, legal open access is still only over 50% globally, and that's only 20% of final published articles, the articles that we see within journals and books. So we're still a very long way away from this aspirational aim of open access being fully in place in 2020. And then we had the pandemic. So, and I have to thank CDC who produced this beautiful image, which has become iconic, and it is itself now in the public domain, so it can be, which is why we see it popping up everywhere. Another great example of Creative Commons licenses and their importance. So what happened then? Well, a few things did. What became really clear was that we needed access to all types of research. So this is, as anyone has spent any time thinking about this coronavirus knows, this is a very unusual disease. This is not the flu, it's not a common cold, it's not even really a respiratory disease. It's actually a systemic, severe disease which can affect people profoundly in many different ways. So we knew that the types of things that we were going to need access to were information about this new coronavirus, and in fact the sequence of it was shared very early, and there were very early publications which talked about the first cases across the world. Then we wanted to know about old coronaviruses. There's the coronaviruses back in SARS back in 2003, that was obviously relevant. Incidentally, a lot of work was done on a vaccine back in 2003, but it was stopped when that medical emergency, which never became a pandemic, actually stopped. Became very clear we needed to know about ventilators because we thought this was a respiratory disease. Face masks became important, and disinfectants obviously were very important. But there was all sorts of things we didn't know we were going to know about. So who knew that we were going to have to think about cruise ships as major vectors of disease? What about drive-through pharmacies? I mean, drive-through testing, that we've changed our whole behaviour. And then even things like how do we manage the whole of society as a response? For example, how do you support athletes? What are the psychological implications of this pandemic? There's been an enormous amount of research that we simply never knew we were going to need access to. And to some extent, that did happen. There was a number of key points that led to a change in behaviour. So back in early February, it became clear that there was going to be a need for research to be made open. There was a call for that, and that's the first point on the bottom line. Later on, became a national call to ask for research for everyone to collaborate, and that happened in March 2020, and that's where you can see the publications beginning to pick up. And then there were subsequent calls after that from a variety of national and international groups, including specific collaborations, for example, among the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association that agreed to combine to work together, and calls from White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And what you can see here is that in the middle graph, there's still the predominant model is publishing in journals. So that's the pink at the top, and there's more by this graph actually stops in April 2020, at which point there have been more than 15,000 articles published. At the bottom of these graphs shows what happened with the preprints. So that's the green in the middle part of the graph, but the bottom divides it up into a diversity of outputs other than journal articles. And there what you can see is that the predominant model of publishing within this area has become two particular preprints servers, that's medRxiv and BioRxiv. And the growth is just astonishing. So back in April, as I say, there'd been more than 15,000 articles published. This is from a preprint itself called Preprinting a Pandemic that analyses what happened to these papers. And since then, preprints have continued to explode. So this is a slide from the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation, who've just put some money in to support medRxiv. What you can see on the left-hand side is the number of preprints that were being submitted to medRxiv. So medRxiv is a really interesting example. It was the second of the preprint servers founded by Cold Spring Harbor, BioRxiv being the first, which had a quiet little launch back in July 2019, was not getting terribly many submissions, and then all of a sudden the need for sharing became absolutely urgent, and the journals simply couldn't respond in the time that the preprint servers could. And so the number of submissions absolutely skyrocketed. And what also happened was the number of views absolutely skyrocketed. So bottom right is the views of these papers. So by mid-April, there'd been 10.9 million views of these articles, which is truly astonishing. This is enormous reach. I looked yesterday what was happening, and yesterday, just within medRxiv and BioRxiv, there'd been more than 7,000 articles on the pandemic published, just within these two models. So that itself is pretty astonishing. We're not going to see this going away anytime soon. I think it's actually quite likely this has changed the publishing behaviour of academics quite substantially and possibly permanently. So other things that happened that were fascinating was it became clear that we needed an aggregation of research. So the US White House, their Office of Science and Technology Policy, put out a call for technology organisations to collaborate and to build a data set of openly available research. And that became the QUT Open Research Data Set. It's got around 130,000 research papers in it at the moment, and as of today, it's been downloaded in its entirety 25 million times. That's the entire corpus. That excludes the small amount of research that's the individual publications. So there's absolutely enormous use of this database. We're seeing publishers changing their behaviour. They're making all their research free most of the time. I'll come back onto that in a minute. Many open access journals have waived their article processing charges for OA journals, and that's been very interesting because you've seen a bit of a democratisation of publishing open access. We've also seen repositories doing interesting things. So Zenodo, which is a repository based at CERN in Switzerland, an open access repository, has developed communities of practice around open COVID research, and this one that's on the screen here is for South America, and that's I think a really nice way of aggregating research. And then there's many national resources, and I've just put the one here, which is from the Australian Academy of Science, which again has collaborated in a lot of different ways, including, for example, gathering together a list of academics who are experts in this area. And then, you know, as happens when you make something open, then resources get built on these resources themselves. And this is just a set of resources that are on the CORD-19 database itself. And the one I just highlight is the one in the bottom right, which is called SciFact. And you can actually type in your claim into this database, and it will look for you to see whether there's any evidence supporting that claim. It's a fantastic example of what's happening. So I think what we've seen is that COVID-19 has made the case for immediate free access, reuse rights, interoperable formats absolutely necessary to support the seamless sharing and collaboration of research. We need the technology behind it, but we have that technology in place. We have the identifiers, we have the sites, we have the formats, we have the linking, and we know what the licenses are. So this is entirely possible to do, and in fact I think in many ways COVID-19 has been a complete triumph of the scholarly publishing system in responding to an emergency. But we already know that some groups are looking to change this and that they are preparing to lock things down after the pandemic, and there's a couple of quotes here that I'll put forward. So one is from Elsevier, which is the largest scholarly publisher, has noted that it's making its research available for as long as the Elsevier COVID-19 Resource Centre remains active. So they are already saying, please note, we will be taking this down when it suits us. And the same we're seeing, the way that they're particularly doing that is by using licenses that they are choosing. And it's not just Elsevier, but Elsevier has particularly been active in this area. So what they're not doing is making things permanently available. They're making them available for as long as they choose. And what does that look like? Well, back in 2014, you may remember we had another global emergency. This was Ebola. And many journals sort of trumpeted the kind of research that they were doing and their intention to make it available. So this was back in 2014. If you look for that same site today, it's not available. So it's a pretty clear example that we can see what's coming. I think we have noticed that this will happen. So what do we need to do? So I think it's pretty simple. We need to secure this information before it disappears, and we need to make that very clear to the publishers. We absolutely need national and regional strategies now, and we need to collaborate internationally to make that happen. This is not going to happen organically. We need to incentivise researchers to share this research openly. I really hope that the research that is pouring into preprint servers will be properly acknowledged by their universities as being valuable. There's no question about that. And we need to plan for the next emergency. We already have many around the corner. You know, climate change is just the next one that we're going to need to address. So thank you very much. That's my plea that we need to be thinking now of the future. I hope very much that this will trigger a proper call to action, and I look forward to following up with any of these initiatives.